Between bye weeks and injuries, there's a lot of question marks at the wide receiver position. Who would have thought that entering week 10 of the fantasy football season, the running back position would be more solidified? So with everything going on right now in the NFL, who are the top 36 wide receivers in week 10? We're talking about it right now. Now, before we get into the Week 10 rankings, I gotta go over a few of my biggest hits and misses from Week 9 here at the wide receiver position. Now, when it comes to a few of my hits, I had guys like Cedric Tillman, Devontae Smith, and Davante Adams. I went double Devontae in Week 9, and all of those rankings turned out to be pretty correct. But I also had some big-time misses. Guys like Jackson Smith and Jigba, who absolutely exploded. Josh Downs, who absolutely did not explode, and then Quentin Johnston had himself probably one of the best games of the season. So I can sit here and honestly say that Jackson Smith and Jigba, Quentin Johnston, they were not ranked high enough last week for what they did on the field. But Week 9 is over, so let's go ahead and dive into Week 10. And we're kicking it off in Tier 1 with Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Malik Neighbors, Cooper Kupp, Garrett Wilson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Tyreek Hill. But let's start off here at the top with Justin Jefferson. He's going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars, the current wide receiver 2 overall, averaging 16.7 fantasy points per game, and has had at least 7 catches in 3 straight ball games. Also has back-to-back games with over 115 yards receiving. Now this matchup going up against Jacksonville, who allows the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. I got Jefferson at number 1. Number 2 is Jamar Chase going up against Baltimore. The current wide receiver 1 overall has had at least 11 targets now in 3 of his last 5 games played. T. Higgins is doubtful to play, and now he gets a matchup going up against Baltimore, who allows the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. In fact, in their last meeting just a couple weeks ago, Jamar Chase had 12 targets, 10 catches, 193 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Really, the only reason I don't have him at number 1 is they're playing Thursday night, and sometimes Thursday night football just blows. All right, next up, we got Malik Neighbors going up against Carolina, and it's crazy to hear that Carolina allows the 13th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but that happens when your opponents are always winning and just running all over you. The volume is back, though, for Malik Neighbors, and this matchup between 2 bad teams really helps Malik Neighbors have that potential for a higher ceiling game. Then we got Cooper Kupp going up against Miami, and he really benefited from the early exit last week of Puka Nacua. Kupp ended with 14 targets, 11 catches, and 104 yards, but Puka should be back this week. Now, Miami still shows statistically that they're tough against opposing wide receivers, but that's because a few of their recent games are against the likes of Tennessee, New England, and Indianapolis, and it's kind of skewing the overall numbers, so Cooper Kupp is at number 4. Number 5 is Garrett Wilson going up against Arizona. And if you remember back a couple weeks ago when the Jets got Davante Adams, we said that was not a bad thing for Garrett Wilson. Yes, he may see less volume, but the increase in efficiency is going to be magical. It is. He's the current wide receiver 9 overall, averaging 14 fantasy points per game, and the Jets are hoping to build some momentum off their win last week. Then we go down to Amon-Ra St. Brown going up against Houston. Now, his yardage totals remain lower overall, but the dude keeps finding the end zone, has a touchdown now in 6 straight games, and Detroit just continues to be up by so many points weekly, they're not having to throw for all 4 quarters. Now in a matchup going up against Houston, they allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and if Nico Collins can return for Houston, maybe we go back and forth a little bit in this matchup and give Amon-Ra St. Brown more opportunities. And then lastly, to finish out Tier 1, it's Tyreek Hill going up against the Rams. Now Tyreek not having a 100-yard game or a touchdown since week 1 is absolutely nuts. The Rams are going to be one of the easier matchups he's had here as of late, though, and at some point you have to think that Tyreek Hill is going to pop off. When? That's the biggest question. What I can tell you, though, is I don't want it to happen on my bench. So now we're through Tier 1. Let's go to Tier 2, where we got Deebo Samuel, Puka Nacua, A.J. Brown, Davante Adams, Drake London, Zay Flowers, and Devontae Smith. But up here at the top of Tier 2, we got Deebo Samuel going up against Tampa Bay. Now, he's coming off the bye week and had a little bit of extra time to get healthy. He now becomes one of the top options on one of the league's top offenses against one of the league's worst defenses in Tampa Bay, who allows over 30 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we got Puka Nacua going up against Miami. He got thrown out last week for the weakest punch I have ever seen, but I guess it gave him a little bit of extra time to get healthy. With this offense, though, you have to expect him and Cooper Kupp to stay fed weekly. Then we go down to A.J. Brown going up against Dallas, and with the knee injury that he suffered, he's currently listed as day-to-day, so really unclear if he plays, and if he does, how much does he actually play? Now, he's back at practice and limited, so we really need to pay attention because this is not a bad matchup if he does end up playing. Now, if you own A.J. Brown, make sure you have a backup plan just in case. Then we go down to Davante Adams going up against Arizona, and we finally saw the quote-unquote breakout of Davante Adams as a Jet last week. Now, in that game, he left for some time to get checked for a concussion, but then came back in and caught the late game-winning touchdown. Kind of broke the seal of the offense. Arizona has been playing well here as of late, but they're allowing 27 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so Davante Adams right here mid-tier 2. Then we got Drake London going up against New Orleans. He's currently dealing with a hip injury and listed as day-to-day. Add the fact that he's been highly touchdown dependent, there is a little bit of concern here. He's had a touchdown in 6 of 9 games, but has only gone over 75 yards receiving one time all season. Now, it does help that Marshawn Lattimore was dealt by the Saints. He's no longer there, and the Saints also allow the 11th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We just need to monitor the hip injury, but if he's good to go, it's a good matchup. Then we got Zay Flowers going up against Cincinnati, and he continues to go off in lineups. He's had at least 15 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games played. He now has 4 100-yard games over his last 5 games played. But you have to think that Deontay Johnson starts to take a little bit of that volume, but that's fine. Last week, Zay Flowers only had 6 targets. He turned it into 5 catches for 127 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now has a matchup going up against Cincinnati, who allows over 24 fantasy points per game. And then we round out tier 2 with Devontae Smith going up against Dallas. We know that A.J. Brown is banged up. Dallas Goedert is banged up. Heck, Devontae Smith himself is dealing with a hamstring injury. Now, Smith has had at least 10 fantasy points in all but 1 game this year, and in this matchup going up against Dallas, they allow over 27 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We really need to watch his status. If he can play in this ball game, he's going to be in a lot of fantasy lineups. Which will now take us down to tier 3, where we got Terry McLaurin, George Pickens, CeeDee Lamb, DeAndre Hopkins, Brian Thomas Jr., Tank Dell, Darnell Mooney, Josh Downs, and Khalil Shakir. For Terry McLaurin, he's going up against Pittsburgh and now has 7 straight weeks of at least 11 fantasy points. The current wide receiver, 14 overall on the season, and has had at least 90 yards receiving or a touchdown in 7 straight games. This is not an easy matchup for him going up against Pittsburgh, but with the running game banged up, we can't count out Terry McLaurin. Then we got George Pickens going up against Washington, his opponent in that game. He's coming off the bye week, and he's really been better with Russell Wilson under center. Over the last 2 games, he's averaged 20 yards per reception. Before Russell Wilson, he was averaging 13.5 yards per reception. The Russ deep ball is helping out George Pickens. Now, we also know they added Mike Williams, but there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve there, and I don't expect him to play 100% of the snaps. In a matchup going up against Washington, who allows 26.9 fantasy points per game, I got George Pickens at 16. 17 is CeeDee Lamb, and yes, this absolutely sucks. He's got a matchup going up against Philadelphia, which does not suck, but this is just another stud wide receiver that's dealing with an injury. He's currently listed as week to week, but does have a chance to play through this shoulder injury. But we gotta remember, Dak is going to miss some time. Do the Cowboys turn it over to Cooper Rush? Do they give Trey Lance an opportunity? The last time that Cooper Rush was the starter in Dallas, CeeDee Lamb still averaged 10 targets per game, so if it is Cooper Rush, it doesn't absolutely kill CeeDee Lamb, depending whether or not he can play through the injury. Then we got DeAndre Hopkins going up against Denver, and he really just broke out in Kansas City last week. 9 targets, 8 catches, 86 yards, and 2 touchdowns, and he's still really kind of working on that connection with Patrick Mahomes. We saw a couple times last week where they weren't on the same page. But does DeAndre Hopkins get the Patrick Surtain treatment in week 10? You have to think that Kansas City keeps him moving around to try to find good matchups throughout the game. Then we got Brian Thomas Jr. going up against Minnesota. And so much for worrying about the rib injury. He just played a season-high 91% of the offensive snaps last week. Now, the volume has been down. 3 of the last 4 weeks, he's only had 3 catches or less, but it is much easier to throw on Minnesota than it is to run on Minnesota. The Vikings currently allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So, Jake, why is Brian Thomas Jr. not so much higher in the rankings? Word just came out that Trevor Lawrence could be done for quite some time, which means they could be turning it over to Mac Jones. Now, obviously, Mac Jones is a downgrade from Trevor Lawrence, but you have to think that he relies heavily on on his top option in Brian Thomas Jr., so that's still why he's up inside the top 20. Now, after Brian Thomas Jr., we got Tank Dell going up against Detroit, and it for sure does not help Tank Dell that Nico Collins could be returning this week. Tank has had at least 10 fantasy points now in 3 of his last 4 games, but it may be hard for Houston to run on the ground against a good Detroit Lions run defense. However, the Lions allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We really need to find out what's going to happen for sure with Nico Collins, but Tank Dell should see some decent volume once again this week. How about Darnell Mooney going up against the Saints? And he kind of benefits from Drake London having any limitations. Mooney continues to see consistent targets. He's had at least 6 targets in all but 2 games this season. He now has a touchdown in back-to-back ball games, and as I mentioned earlier, Marshawn Lattimore is gone, and the Saints allow the 11th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Then we got Josh Downs in Indianapolis going up against Buffalo. He continues to be the leading target getter in this offense with Joe Flacco under center. He just barely missed a few catches last week that really would have given him a bigger day. But he's had at least 9 targets in 5 of his last 6 games, more of a weekly flex play than a safe wide receiver too. And then we got Khalil Shakir in Buffalo going up against Indianapolis. Amari Cooper and Keon Coleman are both questionable to play, which means we're in line for more Khalil Shakir in week 10. He's already had at least 7 targets in 3 straight games, so he becomes a solid flex play here in week 10. Now we move down to tier 4. And in tier 4, we got the likes of Cortland Sutton, Jawan Jennings, Calvin Ridley, Marvin Harrison Jr., DJ Moore, Ladd McConkey, and Deontay Johnson. Now, for Cortland Sutton, he's going up against Kansas City. He has back-to-back games with at least 10 targets and over 100 yards receiving. I can really see the Denver Broncos struggling to run the ball against Kansas City, so you have to think that that volume could continue this week once again for Cortland Sutton. Then we got Jawan Jennings going up against Tampa Bay. He's coming off the bye week, and he's expected to return from injury, but technically is still questionable at the time of this recording. It's a great matchup. We know that going up against Tampa Bay. And when he's healthy, there is a definite need for him in this offense. So if he plays, if he's 100%, he's a solid flex once again. Then we got Calvin Ridley going up against the Chargers. He's continued to be the leading target getter in the Tennessee offense since they've dealt DeAndre Hopkins. It's not really an offense, though, where we can pencil him in for 10-plus fantasy points a week. He definitely needs good matchups, and this is not one of them. The Chargers allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we go down to Marvin Harrison Jr. up against the Jets. And why do the Arizona Cardinals hate Marvin Harrison Jr.? He's only averaging 3 receptions a game for the season, and that is absolutely nuts. He only has 1 touchdown in the last 5 games played, and now he gets a matchup against the Jets, who allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we move down to DJ Moore going up against New England, and continued disappointment is the theme of DJ Moore. How crazy is it that he has had less than 35 total yards in 4 of his last 5 games played? Now, there has been a lot of talk about his walking off the field early with a limp and that Caleb Williams shoulder bump from their game last week. But really, the bigger problem is there's still so many weapons in this offense. I expect a lot of the same boom or bust type performances from DJ Moore. Then we got Ladd McConkey going up against Tennessee. And it's not an easy weekly situation to figure out in LA. It is great that Justin Herbert is starting to throw the ball more each and every week, but he doesn't have a solid weekly number 1 guy. McConkey has had at least 7 targets, though, in 4 of his last 5 games played, and remains the safest weekly option in this offense. Tennessee, however, does allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, though. And then we round out tier 4 with Deontay Johnson. Now, he's going up against Cincinnati Thursday Night Football, and last week he only played 30% of the snaps and didn't even see a target. You have to think that that's going to increase some here in week 10. Now, we know him as a target hog, but we cannot assume that in this offense until we see it. In my opinion, he's a wide receiver 3 rest of season until he can prove to get consistent high volume in a low volume passing offense. Which will then bring us to tier 5, where I have Demarcus Robinson, Jameson Williams, Jalen Tolbert, Michael Pittman, Nico Collins, and Amari Cooper. Now, for Demarcus Robinson, he's going up against Miami, and he continues to win people matchups, myself included. He's had back-to-back games with 2 touchdowns and has 5 touchdowns over his last 4 games played. Defenses are so focused on Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua that Demarcus Robinson is just running free in single coverage down the field. But this isn't just some fluke. He did the exact same thing in 2023 when both Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua were healthy. Then we go down to Jameson Williams going up against Houston. He's coming off his suspension, but that doesn't take away from the fact that he's still pretty big play dependent on a team that hasn't had to throw much lately. He's going to continue to be a boomer bust option once again. Then we move down to Jalen Tolbert going up against Philadelphia. And if CeeDee Lamb is limited at all with the shoulder injury, you have to think that Jalen Tolbert is in line for more targets. However, you also have to think that the touchdown opportunities are going to drop a ton in this offense with Dak Prescott not under center. But in a game going up against Philadelphia that they're going to have to throw the ball, I got Jalen Tolbert at 33. 34 is Michael Pittman going up against Buffalo. That back injury is still bothering him, and he is currently questionable to play. He only has 2 catches over the last 2 weeks combined. Now, I expect Indianapolis to be trailing in this game and throwing for all 4 quarters, and that's why he even made the rankings. Then we're going to end it up with 2 studs, 2 guys who are currently hurt. The first one, Nico Collins going up against Detroit. And I think at this point, everyone knows that if Nico Collins is fully healthy, if he's 100% and he's playing, he is a top 10 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. However, we just do not know for sure yet. Now, even though all signs are pointing to him returning, until he gets officially activated and we know he's going to start and we know he's 100%, I just put him here at the bottom. However, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, if he suits up, if he plays in this matchup, he's a top 10 to 12 wide receiver here in week 10. And then we go down to Amari Cooper going up against the Colts. If he can play, he's in line for a large target share due to the Keon Coleman injury. So let me keep this simple for you. If Amari Cooper is a full go heading into the weekend, it's going to put him right around wide receiver 20 or so in the rankings. So hopefully everyone understands that by me putting Nico down here and Amari down here and then telling you where they will go as long as they're 100% good to go this weekend, hopefully that helps people make a few of their decisions. So there you have the quick and dirty top 36 wide receivers for week 10 fantasy football. We got a lot of bye weeks coming up, and with the injuries starting to rack up as well, the next few weeks may be a little interesting at the wide receiver position. If you enjoyed today's show though, do me a favor and hit the like button if you haven't already, and then consider subscribing. Yes, I know it's already week 10 of the fantasy football season, but we're still getting thousands of subscribers a week, and you need to join Headliner Nation. Now I'm going to go ahead and get out of here today though. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.